Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to talk a little bit about Iraq. The mission was accomplished a while ago, but it looks like they have a new mission or something. But, when we think about this mission accomplished, we do something, and there seems to be a victory. We took Fallujah back again. It's back and forth, and it goes on, and now they're putting more troops on there. The only way anybody could conceive of a mission being accomplished and endorse this policy is somebody could be thriving on chaos, because chaos seems to be winning. But that's probably a little bit of a stretch that anybody would do such a thing deliberately just to sell stuff.
We've talked about it before. It's hard to imagine. It's hard for me to imagine. I know you feel the same way. Do they do this on purpose? Are they purposely messing this up because there's a lot of money in messing things up? Or are that incompetent, and that makes our case for non-interventionism. I go back and forth. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, I generally don't try to interpret, get in somebody's brain and know what their motivations are, because sometimes they don't even know them. Sometimes they just go from day to day. Yeah. And utilitarianism and pragmatism, which is a philosophy in itself, is that way. And that gives them license to do whatever they want on whatever the occasion is in economics and in foreign policy. And that is why you have Democrats and Republicans endorsing, say, troops to Libya and get rid of Gaddafi. At the same time, they can fight and fume, over the results. So, but, I think that probably Bush really believed that remaking the Middle East was good. I don't think he loses any sleep over the total failure of this. And that he might say that, the Democrats didn't follow through on what I was doing, something like that. But they'll rationalize that. I think it's very difficult for them to give up on it. But it's hard for me to believe somebody sits down and plans such stupidity. I think they occasionally would want to have a victory. So I think it's a philosophic failure is what happened. They've endorsed a policy of intervention. They're engaged in doing something we shouldn't be doing, and we're not quite able to do. And I think as our conversation goes today, we're not going to predict, well, it looks like this is another turnaround. Maybe we'll have a mission accomplished finally.
Yeah. Well, backtracking a little bit to where we are now, and at the end of Bush's term, he was trying to negotiate a new status of forces agreement with Iraq. And things that he wanted were, total immunity for all the American troops there and contractors, immunity from Iraqi law, and these sorts of things. They were not able to agree to that, so as a result of that inability to agree, the U.S. had to pull its troops out, I think, by 2011. Well, it was allowed to keep a certain level, and I think about 3,800 troops was allowed to keep in there, and I think it's slightly murky as to what their status is. But now we've seen, as this fight against ISIS ramps up since 2014, a continual process of more U.S. troops. And the reason we're talking about it today is that the Pentagon told the White House, they didn't tell Congress or anyone, they told the White House, we need at least 500 more troops.
Right. I don't think we're capable of really challenging deep-seated motivations, and even though you can try to dissect it, but this troop number that bring up, I think, is important, because they do fudge those figures and they lie to us. But you catch them and then they say, "Oh yeah, that's true." But it was accepted that there were 4,600 combat troops there now, and they're going to put another 560 troops in there, take it over 5,000. But they said that already the 4,600 was wrong, because there's approximately 1,500 military personnel in the embassy. That small little embassy, it just happens to be the biggest in the world, this sort of thing. They say this embassy, so that takes them up to 6,000. That doesn't count the contractors. Yeah. Then you have contractors, and you suggested one time that it could be equal as many contractors, but they don't count them. And so what they're doing now, they're taking over airfields and rebuilding and all this. So they're going to need more contractors probably in this. But the numbers are very, very high, and it's steady. Although they were supposed to have been out of there in 2011, just within a couple years, they started going back in. It's gradually escalating. And the Iraqi government government forces that we train, and I think it costs us like a few bucks to train them. But they're real good, when they're practicing. But don't show them an enemy, and then all of a sudden they lose their enthusiasm, because I think this is an artificial war. I mean, they're not really engaged in fighting for anything. There's just arguments, and we get on one side, and but they don't have their heart in it. And yet we're saying, well, you do it. We can't expose our soldiers to getting shot at. And then they say, well, we are non-combatant. And I keep thinking they say that to reassure the American people that we don't have troops on the ground, and that if you're a non-combatant, they're not going to get upset with us, which is, just a lot of nonsense. Whether we're dropping bombs, or maybe especially if we're dropping bombs and killing people, they're going to get more upset because we're not down there, actually fighting them. And just remember, one of the major reasons of 9/11, the excuse for that, was the constant bombing of Iraq. And so we're back at that again, and now we have troops. We're reinvading, and I don't think the outcome looks too optimistic.
Well, as you point out, all those years of training the Iraqi army, and when ISIS did make a push in Iraq, they turned and ran. They turned and ran away. And I don't know that it was as much cowardice or inability to fight. I think there were other problems, and I think one of them is that the Iraqi army is multi-sectarian. You have a lot of Sunnis in there, and within ISIS you have a lot of Sunnis, including a lot of former Iraqi military people, Sunnis that the U.S. put in jail, including places like Abu Ghraib, when the U.S. took over. And I think there are mixed loyalties between the Iraqi army and the ISIS forces. And that's one of the reasons why the Iraqi army is not strong enough to retake Mosul, for example. They're supposed to have taken it back a year ago. I don't think anybody thinks that they have the ability to take it back, hence us putting in new troops.
Well, the president, just within the last couple of days, was at a NATO meeting in Poland and engaging in that everlasting goal of getting involved in entangling alliances. But as long as we can control the instruments of the entanglement, which is NATO, we're sort of all for it. No, he was there, and he said that Al-Qaeda was conquered, and it was doing well. But he emphasized the recapture of Fallujah. That was a major victory. And, when it comes to specific territory, it looks like on paper saying, hey, maybe they are really making progress. But within the last several weeks, the Al-Qaeda bombed in Baghdad. 300 people being killed. So I would say that bragging about the recapture of Fallujah, I imagine Fallujah is still a mess. I mean, how many times have the bombs fell on there, and how many times have we fought over Fallujah? And even going into Mosul is going to be a mess. And it was this one thing about the air base that they're rebuilding, and we bombed and destroyed it, and they say, well, we recaptured it. And one person said, yeah, but there's nothing left. But once again, we're going to rebuild it. Contractors are going to go to work. We're going to spend money here at home. And, the real irony of this is billions of dollars being spent, and we buy stuff here at home, whether it's an airplane or buying equipment or goods to rebuild these buildings. The GDP goes up. So our GDP is doing pretty good. But the American people get poorer, and we just burn this money up literally by dropping bombs over in Iraq.
Yeah, the GDP goes up in one little tiny area of the U.S. called the Beltway, defense contractors, military contractors. But you're right. I mean, Fallujah, we took Fallujah back, but what's left of it? Nothing. We're taking back absolute ghost towns that will never be able to host a human population.
Right. I would think that the big problem right now, strategically speaking, well, we shouldn't have been there. That was the mistake. And someday, eventually, and I remember the years very well of all the killing going on in Vietnam. And finally, it was admitted we can't win it. Now, the neocons would say, oh, no, 500,000 troops weren't enough to conquer this little country, but they weren't on the side of those who were defending their homeland. But I think, our efforts in Iraq have been a total failure. we have lost. And this dribbling in and dribbling out and bombing and killing and pretending and spending more money, how many years has been going on? Since 2003. And we remember 2002 rather well because that's when the discussions were going on. Yeah. And here it is, 13 years later. I mean, how long are they going to do this? Are they going to do it, make it a 30-year war and try to break a record or something?
Even though that many years have passed, does this feel a little bit to you like Vietnam, where you have this trickle of 500 more in, you need a couple hundred, is this trickle, and you know the train wreck called Mosul is right ahead? Mm-hmm. Does it seem that way?
Well, today, when I was thinking about that very thing, what occurred to me was it was like Vietnam, because the Viet Cong would able to come and attack and cause damage, and then the Americans would arrive and the helicopters would come in and they'd make it secure, and then they'd parachute in and get in. And the Viet Cong would go back and they'd hide in the jungle, and then they'd go back to their guerrilla warfare. Well, we don't have jungles in Iraq, but we also have the jungle of just the population. Mm-hmm. So they will. I mean, right now they don't control Fallujah, but they will reorient themselves. They will organize again, and I think that's what they do. They get pushed back again. It's a guerrilla warfare, and I think they retrench like they did in Vietnam, but they don't have a jungle to hide in. But it seems like they don't get rid of it. Matter of fact, this whole effort, it should have been easy. Oh, this is open land. We can see them, we can spot them, we can bomb them. But it looks like they've been very good, at organizing. And I still am convinced that the easiest way for the bad guys or the people who are trying to fight and kill us, they do it because they're motivated, because we're the outsiders. And then they fight among themselves. And I think I can't, and we can't and shouldn't do anything about that. They're going to do that for a long time. So they fight about who's going to pick up the pieces, and they're in a civil war. And all I can see is that we just make it much, much worse.
Yeah, and there was an interesting article recently in Politico. It was written by a former military officer who had been in Iraq, and he points out he went and he talked to the head of the Peshmerga up in near Mosul, and the first thing he said was that the ISIS has about 20,000 troops. There will be American casualties if this retaking happens. But what I found most interesting about this article and the interview with this Kurdish leader is that he said that a liberated Mosul liberated from ISIS, could actually be the spark of a whole new Iraqi civil war. Because once they retake it, the factions that are necessary to retake it, they are at each other's throats and have been since the first civil war after our liberation of Iraq. So it could be, rather than the beginning of the end, it could be the end of the beginning of a new conflict in Iraq all over again, with you have the multi-sectarian Iraqi army, which is not strong enough to take it by itself. You have the Shia militias, who have been pretty effective fighting ISIS because they're fighting Sunnis. And then you have the Kurds. These three aren't going to, once they get rid of ISIS, sit down and shake hands and have a tea party.
Well, the military plan here is to have the government forces come from the west or the north, and the Kurds coming in the opposite direction. And there's the announcement we got to give the Kurds more weapons. So there'll be weapons, probably American weapons on both sides. Now, when Saudi Arabia comes along, we sort of make them pay for that. We just suffer the consequences. But the Kurds, they probably have been, protecting their oil money and this sort of thing. But we will provide weapons for them, whether we admit it or not. Those weapons are going to be in there. But the consequence, even if they have this success, you're suggesting that just like so often, things get worse rather than better. It's just such an artificial situation.
Because after our liberation of Iraq, Baghdad does not have the authority, the ability to manage the retaking of Mosul. So there will be no central authority at which you need in a military command structure. It's all going to be hodgepodge with the U.S. troops somehow in the background. I mean, it seems like you're putting troops in harm's way for a very dubious exercise.
Well, I've argued that the answer to this is let them sort it out. And if we had not been involved, maybe they would have sorted it out just out of necessity. The Kurds probably would have had a homeland, and the Sunnis probably would have carved out a place, and the Shia. But they might have worked out. They might not have been as antagonistic toward each other if we had not been there. And it would be harder now. But I think this whole idea of separation, even with loose coalitions, it doesn't mean that that they couldn't still exist if they wanted to as a loose coalition. It's less likely now. But I think self-determination is it. If people can't have self-determination and it's imposed by other neighbors or outsiders or the United Nations or NATO, all coming in here and deciding what is best. We remade the Middle East once. We did that after World War I and didn't do so well. And we've been tinkering for a long time, but in this century, it's all been remaking the Middle East again, and their mission has not yet been accomplished.
Yeah. People, when they hear the arguments for non-interventionism, will say, oh, yeah, well, what would you do then? How would you fix it? But like libertarianism itself, non-interventionism is not a utopian philosophy. It recognizes that there will be bad things happening. Things will not be perfect. But what we say is they'll be less bad than if we go in and try to do something. And if anything, the last 16 years have been the perfect example of the intellectual appropriateness of this philosophy.
Well, and they shouldn't totally ignore what has happened over the centuries in Switzerland. They have various languages, various independent states. They don't have a strong executive branch. They don't have any foreign policy adventurism. They have not had to suffer. World War I and World War II, they didn't invade Switzerland. So it's a rich country. You'd think, well, maybe they would invade. But it didn't happen. But it wasn't a uniform country. They had these cantons. It reminds me of what maybe the founders would have liked to have seen happen in our country. Independent states have come together voluntarily and shared some things. Maybe a monetary system and maybe some national defense. But this whole thing that you have all the authority gravitating one place. If they expect that we can go in and establish a national authority in Iraq that can bring these factions together, I think they're going to resent us. I think they have been resenting us, and I think as times go on, it's going to get much worse. And the more tougher we get, the more radical jihadists are formed because they're sick and tired of what we're doing.
Yeah. And if I can just put a plug for an article I put up on the Ron Paul Institute's website today, because the question is, how do we get to this mess? And our old friend Jim Jatras wrote a great article about the central role that the media plays in being the government mouthpiece. And it's a depressing outline of how they operate. But Jim concludes, though, that the mainstream media is losing its hold on the population. And we've talked about this on the show before. The numbers are against them. It's losing its hold. Alternative sites, and Jim actually mentions the Ron Paul Institute site, among others, are taking people's attention away from the mainstream media. So there's a positive message, but still looking in the past at how the media is literally the mouthpiece of the government, just like in the Soviet Union.
I think that's absolutely right. I might just add on to this that the global war on terrorism is the vehicle that the media uses, because nobody can be against terrorism or for terrorism. They have to be against it, and it galvanizes people, even though the odds of an American being killed by a terrorist attack in this country is minuscule compared to being struck by lightning. And yet, the global war on terror, and just think, and that's why once you see one person killed, terrorism, what's going on, and all the excitement, and we terrorize the American people is what we do. But then they support a militant type of foreign policy. Then they'll say, well, we see this stuff, and they're so dangerous, and they did this, and it works into it. But I think that anything that can promote the global war on terrorism, so in that way, I think there is a definite strategy of those who want to be involved and they want to promote this whole attitude of having an enemy to fight and promote the military-industrial complex. I think that's very real. How it gets started, and what are the motivations, that's a little more difficult. But I think once we get at a stage like this, I think they milk it. You always have to have an enemy. Just think, Daniel, how how they always had to have an enemy. At first, it was the Persian Gulf War. They had to build up an enemy for that first effort over Kuwait. And then later on, they had to build Saddam Hussein up. And look at Gaddafi. They have to have an enemy, and they can do that as long as a global war on terrorism and people beg and plead that their civil liberties be sacrificed. And in order to have win this global war on terrorism, and the media is only too happy to participate. So I see the only thing that can solve this is more information to the American people and get the people to understand what is going on and why we live in fear and why we don't have to live in fear. I think that is the only thing that will solve it. And the principle behind it would be a foreign policy of non-interventionism, one that is based on a non-aggression principle. That is, we don't do anything to other people that we wouldn't put up with if they were doing it to us. That would go a long way to solving our problems. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.